Hello, everybody. We are here today to talk about why projects fail and why they succeed. Hello, everybody. We are here today with Chris Armstrong. Chris is a business architect, and he's also an enterprise architect. He is the CEO of Sparx Services North America, and he's also the founder of Armstrong Process Group. Chris, thanks so much for being here today.
More than happy to be a part of it, Michael. Thanks for the opportunity.
Chris, I know you're a very experienced old hand at IT, being an IT information enterprise architect. I'm curious what your thoughts are, your unique perspective that you bring to this question of why so many projects seem to fail or go over budget or go over schedule in our industry. This is something that has bedeviled us for 50 years or, since the beginning of the industry. We've never really figured out how to solve it. It doesn't appear that anybody's really figured out what the root causes are. This is a multi-billion dollar problem. What are your thoughts about it? Why are we having these problems, and why does this persist to this day?
Well, I think it's manifold. I'm going to leave the root causes of why do individual projects have the challenges they do to the project management community, coming at this from more of an architecture perspective. But perhaps you and viewers are familiar with the chaos report done by the Standish Group over so many decades that tried to get to the root causes, and typically it had to do with a lack of stakeholder engagement and a lack of a clear understanding of requirements and what the outcome was going to be. And so when they, those numbers have improved modestly over time, but to your point, still to this day, it is 2022. People still really struggle with being able to deliver something useful that meets requirements on time, that's going to meet the operational and business strategic goals over time. But the big challenge I see, particularly large scale organizations, so Fortune 1000 companies, government agencies, they have portfolios of thousands of projects. So on any given day, it is not unusual that there could be 1, 2, 3,000 projects going on at the same time across the enterprise. Particularly if it's segmented into different product groups spread across the globe internationally. And I remember, I think the largest scale I saw was a very large organization that literally had 10,000 projects going on any given day. I mean, that's pretty exceptional. So that's the top of the scale. But even, again, Fortune 100 companies, they're spending a lot of money on IT, and a lion's share of that is to try to help achieve the business strategy, whatever that might be, and how well that is clear to people is something I'll talk a little bit about. So in some ways, when we look at it at a higher level across the entirety of the business ecosystem and landscape, a different question might be, what are we spending our money on, and what are we getting out of it? Because one of the challenges I think a lot of organizations face is that they start projects that they shouldn't have started. So, of course, agile software development is, very much becoming the norm of how IT organizations deliver, functionality. And a lot of that's about optimization, of how much time people spend having tight feedback loops, continuous integration, continual delivery, continual, feedback. But you can only optimize something so much, as it relates to how do you, make those projects run faster, quicker, and better. Well, there's a higher order question, which is, should we even have done this project in the first place? Was it really a good idea? So it's a higher order optimization of really kind of the entirety of the portfolio. So one of the ways, I think, some of the anecdotal and empirical research suggests that, because of the lack of a clear understanding of requirements, which could be attributed to either, we couldn't engage the stakeholder and really elicit what their requirements were, either because of lack of availability, lack of interest, we didn't have good business analysis skill, whatever the issue is. But sometimes those can be indications of, well, for example, lack of stakeholder engagement. Well, maybe this really isn't that important. I mean, if the stakeholder is distracted by something else, there's something more important going on in his or her life. So we want to think about maybe we shouldn't start doing work unless we're really certain it makes sense to do it. So a big part of what organizations often are looking at trying to do is to shift the needle from how much money are they spending to keep the lights on, so basically daily operational costs, and then how much of their budget is, available for, doing transformational things that really add value, that deliver on the business strategy. And I'm sure there's, again, a lot of both anecdotal empirical data out there on that distribution. But, imagine that if you're spending 75% of your IT budget, just keeping the lights on when it has to do with, servers, applications, licensing, people, all that stuff, and you only have 25% of your budget available to do innovation, that really constrains the ability for the organization to, put all of its resources towards, realizing the strategy versus just keeping from running out of business. You know what I'm saying?
You mentioned stakeholder engagement and how important that is, and that perhaps if you don't have stakeholder engagement up front, maybe you want to reconsider actually doing the project. Are there any other very, very critical on your short list of key performance factors or indicators in addition to stakeholder engagement that you would want to include on a short list of maybe 3 to 5 items that are mission critical things that you need to be tracking throughout the course of a project?
Yeah, and I look at it through the lens of business architecture in particular. So,
well, you have to explain. Could you explain what you mean by that? Because that's a term that I'm actually not quite familiar with.
Sure. So, the idea is we want business architecture is a practice. There's a professional community that's very active in developing out this profession called the Business Architecture Guild is one of them. They have a body of knowledge called the Business Architecture Body of Knowledge, or the BizBoc Guide. There's also standards from the Open Group around architecture development best practices, and there's been some good work between those two communities to basically try to present to the community, this is what business architecture is and what those practices. But ultimately what business architecture is about is trying to provide transparency and visibility into the complexity of the business ecosystem so that executives can make good decisions to deliver on strategy and that the organization can actually deliver on the strategy. So that's probably the key thing. So people have been trying to figure this stuff out for decades. It started back in, the 80s with John Zachman, at IBM. So it's not like a new thing that people are trying to solve a problem for. But the idea is it's, matured over time, getting a little bit more mainstream. And of course, organizations and complexity and the pace of change is only, continued to accelerate. So in our view, the need for having a consistent, common, simple way of looking at the enterprise to inform those decisions is really critical. So, one of the challenges that a lot of large organizations have particularly is that they get overwhelmed with the complexity of themselves. There's just so many moving parts, not just in IT, there's hundreds, possibly thousands of applications, both on-premise and in the cloud, or SaaS stuff. There's lots of different product lines, lots of different political organizations, lots of different physical offices. So there's all this complexity, and then they have all these processes, for doing things to keep the lights on. And even business things, payroll, HR, notwithstanding, how do they sell products, service those products, work with their customers, develop new products. And the challenge is there's just so much going on that at the enterprise, it's really hard for particularly the C-level executives to see what's going across everything, because everybody uses a different language and they're using different IT systems. So for example, one of the common components of a lot of organizations' business strategy is acquisition. So we're going to grow by acquiring other companies, whether that's to get new products, enter a new regulatory market, capture a new customer base, whatever, the rationale is. Well, as you might know, and I'm sure viewers, those large organizations, they end up accidentally accumulating a whole bunch of redundancy, right? They have multiple procurement systems, multiple HR systems. notwithstanding all the software applications that support it and all the staff that support it. And so this complexity tends to get worse over time if you don't stay on top of it. And so we've got the ability to, instead of becoming victims of complexity, we want to become masters of complexity. And business and enterprise architecture provide a set of standard practices and a common lens for looking at that enterprise in a more simplified fashion. So you don't get distracted by the complexity. We still have to contend with it eventually, but the executives, that are trying to make these large scale, big investment decisions, they want to understand the consequences of it. Like, hey, if I change this thing over here, is that going to be an easy thing or is that going to be a really hard thing? What are the downstream consequences? How does this affect other partners, in our ecosystem and other stakeholders within the organization?
Well, I mean, creating a framework, a standardized framework that maintains transparency and visibility in the face of all this complexity seems like a very, very tall order. How accepted is this concept of business architecture is this BizBot community in your estimation? How widespread is it? How well known is it? Has it gained any traction?
Oh yeah, yep, definitely. I don't have any particular stats, but it of course may not be a coincidence that the majority of the clients we work with are those that are seeking this type of advice. So I'd say 80% of our clients are looking to solve a business problem, which again, how do I make good investment decisions about how to deliver on my business strategy? And we lead with business architecture as the way to do it. So in our little part of the world, it's very, very prevalent. But just knowing, the community, and again, the Business Architecture Guild is one of the communities. There are others, but the peers that I network with, this is very popular across different industries and different sectors. So it's hard for me to say, Michael, that it's been adopted 25%, 50%, 75%, but it is and also supported by different research organizations, both out of public-private education as well as market research like Gartner and Forrester and stuff like that. They've made recommendations to make investments in business architecture, and it's really considered to be one of the leading topics in the literature. So it's being employed in a lot of places.
I want to go back to this question of the KPIs. You had mentioned the importance of stakeholder engagement, and we took a little detour to understand the importance of business architecture. Besides stakeholder engagement, though, if you had, I had to force you to put together a short list of 3 to 5 extremely important elements that, if they're missing or they're lacking, are going to lead to project failure. What would you say?
Well, it's kind of related to the similar theme, which would be strategic alignment. So how does this project relate to something that's on this, the business strategic plan? So not the IT strategic plan, the business strategic plan.
And is that because the project will lose support and lose funding if it's not related to that plan? Because we're talking about the ability to manage a project to completion successfully.
Yeah, so part of it is, one of the things I see is a lot of organizations spend a lot of money doing kind of business as usual projects that are kind of like redecorating and refurnishing the same rooms in the house over and over again. It's like, no, we want shag carpet. No, we want tile. Let's paint the walls green. Let's change this to a bay window. Let's get a different kind of sofa. But it's fundamentally the same room. So people are doing these cosmetic, less strategic things in known stable areas. But there's other parts of the house that are incomplete. This roof isn't up. It's burning down. There's water coming into the foundation. We need to build a new wing because we're doing something different. So without understanding strategic alignment, that should give you a moment of introspection to say, hey, should we be doing this investment? I mean, if we are really trying to, as an IT organization that has a big part in delivering on the strategy, because of course, in today's world, IT is involved in, I don't know if you have any stats, Michael, but 95% of most, serious business transformation projects involve non-trivial changes in IT. It's not just, hey, we're going to change our, hiring process. So, if we think about, how many projects are going on, considering that we have a finite amount of resource, namely, if we've decided we're going to invest $1 billion, in IT, how much of that's going to be spent towards, again, delivering the strategy? 20 billion, why we spend everything else just to keep the lights on and move furniture around in the same house. So without strategic alignment indicators, it should really give you an opportunity to say, should we really do this project? Because a part of being successful as the entirety of the enterprise is not having too many projects going on. So a pretty bold thing for someone to say like myself is, maybe the problem isn't how you run individual projects, not to suggest there aren't opportunities for improvement in those areas, but maybe you should stop doing so many projects. You're bringing unnecessary complexity for little value, right? So really question those investments. And particularly if you're trying to move the needle from, we're starving our innovation budget at the expense of keeping the lights on. Well, that's never going to change until someone says, no, we are not doing that project. We're not redecorating that room again. We have to work on the new stuff. So that really informs, some of the hard choices that executives need to make about where their investments are going. And sometimes there's an issue with how well that business strategy is really communicated, down to this next level of directors and down into management. So a lot of times executives don't really know how much money is really being spent in the things they think should be spent on, because there's lack of clarity, sometimes intentional obfuscation. So you think you're spending, $100 million on, making this non-trivial change to your business, but then you find out later they only spent 25 billion on it, 75 billion, and on something else. And then what did you get out of it as it relates to, making more money, or creating better products, or providing better service, things that deliver actual business value. So that'd be the second one, strategic alignment.
Right. A lot of what you're talking about is it fair to say would fall underneath the rubric of governance, correct?
Yeah. Yep. Right. And so that's a big part of what the standard practices that enterprise architecture, and business architecture embraces governance, which is, coming up with these common views and, looking at the enterprise through this lens requires, staying on top of that. And then, when we talk about, investing money in a capability and how that impacts how we deliver value through a value stream, we want to make sure that all that content is on top and that the enterprise as a whole is all on the same page. Because, for example, one thing that we see sometimes is that unknowingly there are multiple parties in the organization trying to change the same thing, but they're trying to change it in different ways. So that's in creating an inherent conflict within the organization, which can lead to delays in the project. Like, well, I didn't know those guys were messing with that. I thought I was, an island. I could do whatever I wanted. So understanding again that interconnectedness, between systems and processes and the teams that use it, can really help, understand what are you getting yourself into when you're making some of these investments.
And who's responsible for making sure that these things are aligned and that these projects stay on track? Is it the PMO or is it the rank and file project manager? I mean, who needs to basically, who's playing the most important role here?
Right. Well, we think of it as a partnership, particularly between the project management office and the business and enterprise architecture team. And there are certainly other stakeholders involved as well. But, the PMO is very much accustomed to reporting about projects, right? And some of the traditional measures of, time, money, and requirements, are those common measures, right? But we enterprise architecture offers some additional perspectives so that the PMO can provide a higher level language for saying, well, here's all of the money you're investing in your portfolio. So because it is about portfolio management, that set of assets that we're trying to again get something of value out of to grow, or possibly divest things out of that portfolio. So being able to say, hey, I know that you want to do the ABC project, but we've taken it into our intake process. And first of all, did this just come out of nowhere, or was this like pre-planned? Is this a part of an overall set of programs and strategies? And how does it fit in? You're claiming that by doing this, you're going to, save this much money or, capture these, this number of customers, how are you going to prove that? Because we're going to come back and measure it. So that's one of the other challenges that has to do with the lack of success, is never going back and determining, did you actually succeed? Because in our opinion, like a lot of program managers, it's not about finishing the project on time and on schedule and delivering something useful. It's about, was it worth it? Was that a good investment? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. But I'm still wondering, though, it's all part of the larger framework. But when you get down into the day-to-day operationally, where are these? If we agree that a project is aligned and that it's a project that we should be doing, it's still not coming in on time, on budget.
That doesn't mean you can claim victory, right?
Right. I mean, you can have two things. I mean, you can have a beautifully executed project that should not have been done to begin with. And
Correct.
You can have a project that was perfectly aligned strategically, which failed miserably. So, assuming that we have a project that has been well governed, that it's where the strategic alignment exists, we're still having 70% failure rates with the projects themselves. Where do you see that breakdown? Is it in terms of? Clearly, stakeholder engagement is one of many critical success factors. What would be some of the others, in addition to just sort of general communication, that you'd like to highlight?
Sure. Well, within an individual project, you might not be surprised. My claim would be, it's not always clear what an individual project's supposed to do. A lot of people have some good ideas and good assumptions. It ends up being more difficult to build the thing than people thought.
But when you say it's not clear what the project is supposed to do, does that failure lie in the inadequate project charter? Would that go back to the project charter? Or
charter and requirements. Yep.
So, okay.
Yep.
So poor charter and poor requirements would be a factor.
And then people find out it's a lot more difficult to build this. And of course, that's the other part of the decision making. Is this something we're going to build? Or is it something we're going to purchase? So we're going to, get a package. Is it going to be on-prem? Is it going to be SaaS? And this is a part of, again, that investment kind of discussion is, generally speaking, because custom software development is one of the most risky things to do, we should do it when it's absolutely necessary and only necessary, right? So part of it is like, hey, are we building a new mobile app? C#, REST APIs, blah, blah, blah. Are we, microservices? Or, are we talking about trying to automate a common, what we call, a common business capability, where we can buy a piece of software that does it? Does it do it exactly the way we want? Maybe, maybe not. Then we should make a really hard choice. Well, should we change it to match us, or should we change to match it, right? And again, focus on, those things that are giving us the biggest bang for the buck. But if you're going to build it, even if it's quote unquote as simple as, hey, we're getting a package or software as a service, you still need to configure it, right? And you need to integrate it, and those are often where some of the challenges are. So, for example, we need to make sure that those systems are integrated with our identity management systems, SSO, for example, so that we have a uniform platform for managing, the network security vulnerabilities. We need to integrate those systems with other internal systems or other SaaS solutions. So a big part of what architecture is about at any level is understanding how do things work together. So interoperability. And then how do they, actually integrate? So how do processes integrate? How do the IT systems exchange data? All that kind of funky stuff. So,
and of course, that also touches on issues of technical resource availability, subject matter expertise,
correct,
availability. Underestimating some of those issues are going to cause problems down the line, and I can see how that would create a lot of bottlenecks.
And we think the architect has a critical role on a project. So that's be one of the things is that, what's the criteria for a project where it requires an architect versus an architect would be nice, but maybe there's, we don't have enough of them, or maybe it's a minor project that doesn't need that kind of architecture guidance. So that's, one of the change management things that we're always concerned about in the PMO community is just what is the understanding by the project manager and the PMO about what an architect does and why they're important. And a lot of times when you're going through that change, there's some complaints from the PMO, namely, I don't know what this person is talking about. They're really expensive. They sure make things out to be a lot more complicated than I think they are. But then after going through a couple of rounds of projects with a good architect, most PMs come back and just go, my goodness, the perspective an architect provided was invaluable. I would never want to do a project without an architect again, because a big part of a project manager's responsibility is to manage the risk register, right? And architecture is again a lens that we can use to describe to the team, as well as the project manager. We can then take that to stakeholders about, here are the risks that we are facing, both organizationally and technically, and getting into things. And part of that might be, hey, we're being asked to use new technology, but we don't have people that know that technology. So either we got to train them. So is that in the plan, project manager? Or we've got to acquire specialized resources that may be more expensive. You got that in the staffing, plan. And the architect is, trying to be very empirical and trying to embrace, some of the agile delivery principles of courage and honesty, which is, this is going to be tough. We've never done this before. I think, here's a plan for how we're going to tackle it. We considered a couple of options. So a big part of what an architect does is help a team select across multiple alternatives to solve a problem, and bring knowledge to the table to say, hey, guess what? You guys aren't the first people to try to solve this problem. Another project already solved this problem, or another team's working on a new common solution. So helping to try to really bring that organizational knowledge to an individual project, so that, because a big part of, in my opinion, as a success is spending the least amount of time creating the least amount of software, where a lot of developers are like the opposite. Well, I want to create lots of software and spend a lot of time doing that. And the PM and the stakeholder are like, no, actually, we want you to reuse stuff. Don't build something over again if we already got something. And if something that we have isn't quite right, let's make an investment in it so that we can solve this problem once for all projects, instead of every project solving it their own way. And that introduces, again, overspend, new risk, having to be mitigated continually. And you really don't have the opportunity to, exploit that investment, across the enterprise. So, common solutions, common technology platforms, common ways of integrating applications. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the techniques that the architect can bring to help mitigate, some of those technical risks. Does that kind of make sense, Michael?
Yeah, sure it does. When we talk about projects, when they failure rates, specifically, I'm thinking of the Standish report myself, which is what most people are familiar with. They say three things. They say projects fail outright, they go over budget, they go over schedule. Yep. But I've always wondered if 2/3 of the problem which is going over budget and going over schedule, if that's directly related to our inability to effectively estimate. And, obviously, if we're not estimating properly, we're always going to come in over budget, and we're always going to come in over schedule. Yep. And so, to what extent are these problems, would 2/3 of the problem be related to estimation? And how can we fix that problem? That would seem to relate to the fact that we don't collect data properly. We're not saving project data. There aren't any general universal repositories that are large enough to be useful. Plus the fact that technology is changing so quickly that one project, there's no consistency across projects that it's always apples to oranges. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the difficulty of estimation and how that may be part of this problem.
Yep. And I think a part of it is also the perspective of what do you mean by estimate, and what does that mean to me as a stakeholder when you give me an estimate? But I'll put that aside, just for a second. But as you correctly noted, Charles Deming back in the day, right, said you cannot control what you cannot measure. So there is a big issue with what kind of record keeping do people do on projects, and how is that collected across the enterprise and baselined against some common ways of representing how people spend their time. That's another big part of the challenge. And then having the opportunity to find that data, look at that data, inform it. There's been, this has been a classic, issue with software development since the beginning of time, right? Which, was, maybe 60, 70 years ago. And, there's the the Kokomo method, which has been around for decades. That's estimation by analogy, so it's really hard for me to, particularly if we want to get down to like work breakdown structure levels, which, the agile development is not so much into that anymore. But, hey, I did a project like this that was in this environment with this kind of organizational and technical risk and blah, blah, blah. And so I, do a swag and go, that's about $45 million. And again, try to support it with pseudo empirical data like, person hours and hardware infrastructure costs and blah, blah, blah. But, a part of it can be, again, an architect can help with that, to be really mindful about risk. So that's, how much, when you're doing your estimation, how much of it has high credibility and how much of it doesn't, because that's one of the challenges, is it kind of gets all lumped together. Mm-hmm. So if an architect could help you go, and based on working with your business analysts, this part of the project seems pretty straightforward, not saying for sure, but seems like requirements are pretty well understood, makes sense to most people. But, this part, how we integrate with this system, how we use this new technology platform, how we integrate with this new technology partner, there's some ambiguity there. So I know, one of the things that one of my first bosses said in the business when I was back as a developer, he'd ask me the same question. Okay, Chris, how long is it going to take you to do that? And I'd go through some rationalization of coming up with a number. And then he said, well, what I do, Chris, is I take your number, double it, and I add 2 weeks.
That's so funny, because I worked with our former chief information officer for 20 years. And he used to say, take any estimate, double it, and get 50%. That must be an old axiom.
Yeah. But I think it's kind of interesting that people have this, and that's what I meant by what do these estimates mean to people? Because people are like, okay, I know that's what you think it's going to take, but history tells me it's going to take longer than that. So I'm going to pad the budget. I might not tell you, but I'm going to give you whatever it is, a little bit of overage. But it does really come back also to, again, with good alignment with particularly things like the capability model and the information model and the value model, we can describe requirements more concisely and clearly using that common language. So that can help, making sure people really know what they're signing up for. But the other part is the need as an agile organization, not just agile software development, but agile portfolio management and agile business architecture, and agile strategic planning and strategic management. You want to have those tight feedback loops, because doing planning is not about executing the plan. It's about thinking about how you're going to deliver. Make sure you understand those different dimensions, and make sure you don't lose sight of that. Because success is not, I accomplished every task in the work breakdown structure. That's a means to an end, right? But there's, how many times has it happened that you make a big investment, and you come into work the next day, and the whole world has changed. And like, the most important thing in the world yesterday, well, there's a new bright shiny object now, and we're chasing that. So, organizations need the ability to reevaluate their strategy and their enterprise, delivery plan at a moment's notice and change it. But a lot of times, and this has to do with culture, once a project is started in an organization, it is never canceled. It gets a life of its own, and it's really hard to have the courage to make those statements and then follow through with it, because there are consequences, to different parts of the organization. People don't, get the budget and resources they want, and that's not much fun, and blah, blah, blah. So, understanding how that all fits together, and that, a new project comes up, and hey, they're messing in the same area you are, maybe they should join the project instead of doing a separate thing. So having that, those feedback loops to continually know that you understand what the target is, you're still on target, because the target might have shifted. And then there's the big thing we want to keep in mind is that a lot of this initial planning is still speculative. I mean, we're doing it based on rigor and science and an objective viewpoint, but some things you just don't know until you try them out. So we really want to make sure, particularly the software engineering, IT developers, they're at the front line, exploring the frontier. We want to make sure we get learnings from them to say, hey, enterprise architect, we thought we knew what we're talking about and how to integrate to this system with this new protocol, blah, blah, blah. It made perfect sense when we were doing it on a whiteboard. We went out and did it. didn't quite work out right for all sorts of reasons. Whatever those are, it doesn't really matter. But the whole point is you want to have that feedback loop so the enterprise architects go, oh, really? That didn't work? Well, that's really important to know. We need now we need to figure out how it does work or whether an alternate strategy is a better approach, and then share that information, not just with your project, but all the other projects that are going to be impacted by it. So again, being able to instantaneously understand what the impact of a change would be. That's one of the kind of base use cases for business and enterprise architecture is instantaneous enterprise impact analysis that has high levels of credibility and confidence.
What do you think about just going from the the very brainiac kind of rare air that you've been exploring for the past 30 minutes, getting down to some more basics, such as just how are they communicating status on projects to their stakeholders? Because it would seem that if you have good, simple, clear communication at regular points throughout a project, like say on a daily or weekly basis, I'm not sure what the periodicity needs to be, that you will be able to identify when projects are going off the rails before they go off the rails. And it's the same thing in healthcare. It's like they'll talk about preventative medicine.
Right.
Most people don't go to a doctor, to a hospital until the disease has already gotten so bad that they can't function and it's become noticeable. And
if you'd have done your annual checkup, they probably would have caught it and saved everybody a lot of time, trouble, and pain.
Right. And preventative medicine is this huge opportunity because it can save all this money. You hear the same thing with software development, with software testing. If you catch these problems, early in the testing cycle, it becomes cheaper and cheaper and easier to deal with. And so when it comes to actually managing projects, like what's the analogy here? Is the communication structure suboptimal in your experience? What are people doing wrong? What are they doing right in your experience?
I'll be introspective because a lot of the work that we do is hopefully project driven. We just don't come in and wave magic wands to do stuff because people, watched a YouTube video or read a book. It's because they have a business problem and they want to solve it. And so most of our clients are they probably know a little bit about enterprise architecture. They might have tried it a couple times in the past, but they want to try to take that next step. Well, we run that like a project. And one of the biggest challenges we have, at least the big thing that I can tell you that makes one of the biggest differences is that there's a project manager. And so, maybe to state the obvious, a lot of teams are kind of self-governing, because that's a part of the ethos and belief system of the Agile community. But I got to tell you, if someone either doesn't step up and say, I am going to play the role of the project manager, that's not actually my job title, but someone's got to do it. And I'm going to commit, 50% of my time to do that. Of course, having a professional, not necessarily full-time, but, a dedicated project manager, right? A project manager that's been trained in best practice, understands our method, how all that communication works. So I see it's kind of related to what I see also in the architect space, which is there aren't enough architects. And so you have to make really, judicious decisions about how to distribute that precious resource. I think the same thing could be said about project managers. Is we want to make sure that there is someone actually in charge of doing all these things. You have to do some planning. Maybe you don't create a detailed work breakdown structure for the next 6 months. You have to know who your stakeholders are. You have to, have daily stand-ups and keep them to daily stand-ups and not have them devolve into discussions about how you're solving a particular project problem. And a part of all this, I think, again, from a transparency perspective, is you got to maintain this data in some kind of repository, whether it's, Azure DevOps TFS or Jira or, other types of solutions. There's no shortage of software, solutions for this, right? But if you don't put the data in someplace, how is that supposed to bubble up? So, the more that the status reporting is based on the mechanics of human beings, the more likely it's not going to get done or not get done timely or empirically. So we want to try to, again, to your point earlier, how can we do estimation if we don't have a a common repository that has the results of the last, estimations. So it's kind of the same thing. So that way, if management wants to know what's going on, they should be able to go to a dashboard and it should be being fed metrics live. Again, we think business architecture should be a dimension of that lens, for that strategic, alignment in addition to, money, time and whatnot. But also, again, risk is another big part of what architecture can help with. So again, having a project manager and having them do due diligence, and which is appropriate for the scale of the project and its complexity and its team structure, and capturing that data and reporting it regularly. To me, that's the big breakdown, and because a lot of projects think they're doing just fine, right? And then it's only until someone's asked, a steering committee says, well, we need a report, and you go, holy crap, man, I got to tell this to the steering committee. I mean, we are doing okay, but we forgot about a couple things and we overspent there. And boy, it's June, 2022 already. So,
right.
Does that
everybody knows this. So, yep. It's just sort of very well known. Final question I have for you, just a little slightly off topic, but I'm curious, everybody's allowed to make a prediction here about the future. What do you think, about the prospects of machine learning and artificial intelligence for possibly being able to improve estimates over time on projects by the combination of computing power being deployed and machine learning models being deployed against, large data pools, possibly to optimize our ability to sort of estimate? Sure. And maybe even also, what are your thoughts about the ability of AI, if it continues its inexorable march, its ability to improve the art and science of managing projects?
Yeah, well, I mean, for whatever it's worth, we've been asking similar questions about the architecture profession. Okay, and of course, you wonder, when will we get to, the matrix where the programs are hacking themselves, right? So software that's writing software, and that's been a big part of, the evolution of tools, over the years, right? First, second, third, fourth generation tools, blah, blah, blah. But of course, as an architect, we want to be cautious about being overly arrogant. But, I'd like to believe, no way could a machine replace what I do as an architect. But that might be it's certainly biased, and that might be a little short-sighted. But, AI and ML, and again, I'm not an AI ML expert, but that's one subject matter that obviously comes up in.
But it's as I said, it's okay. Everybody's allowed to have an opinion.
But so everybody's allowed to have an opinion. Is that in order for that to scale or actually have a stable foundation, you need the data. You can't train an ML engine without having a data set that you can point it to say this is good, this is bad, because that's how it's supposed to learn, right? So without data, it can't learn. So that gets back to our earlier position. But I think because there's a lot of other dimensions if you think about it. There is no shortage of data in an organization. It's just not being well managed and exploited. And that's, again, one thing we think architecture can help with. But just imagine, that there was some ML AI engine that not only monitored your Kanban, and your burn and backlog and all that kind of stuff, but it also monitored your chats and your emails and your updates to your SharePoint site or your modeling repository or your GitHub repository. And based on the frequency of interactions, the topics of those interactions, AI/ML could spot trends and say, this project just recommitted this code 17 times in the past, 48 hours. That is anomalous. What's up with that? It could be something that they're having a problem with GitHub, or it could be like they're seriously struggling with doing some integration. And so it could sense through different measures, there's something going on here that's you should pay attention to, or there's a lot of chat in MS Teams or Slack about this topic. So there's all this data, and some of it's not structured, where I think AI and ML could really help exploit that to the benefit of the learning of the enterprise and advising executives and project managers when things might be going off the rails.
I think the first organization that figures this out is going to make a mint. It's a huge opportunity.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Because again, and the reason I, said with some arrogance, a computer will never replace the job I do. I think the same thing said about the project manager. But how, getting back to kind of our strategic investment, distribution exercise, how much of a project manager's time is being spent doing things only a human can do that are absolutely essential for success, and how much time are they spending doing bookkeeping and chasing people down and writing emails and putting together steering committee presentations? It's like, that may be what you have to do to interact, although you should question, do we really need to do that? If I have to spend 40 hours doing a steering committee deck, I'm not spending 40 hours managing the freaking project. What do you want me to do? You want me to manage a project or tell you how good it is? Blah, blah, blah. So the more we can free up humans to only do what humans can do well, or the special sauce that we expect out of humans, I think we'll get a lot of positive results. So just imagine if you could have, reduced the administrative burden of a project manager by 50%. Just say, hey, 10 of the hours a week you'd spend, trying to update the ABC backlog and do status report. You don't have to do that ever again. You've now reclaimed 10 hours of your week, 25% of your time to do actual project management. I mean, I think that could make a real difference. You know what I mean?
Chris, it was fantastic having you. You have so much there's so much we can learn from you. It was just the time flew by, and
It sure did.
I so much hope that we can have you back to discuss other topics, because you have a lot to share. You're an absolute polymath, and it's just great to have you with our community. So thanks so much for your time today.
Been nothing but a pleasure, Michael.